Cool. So I will introduce our next speaker, who is Victoria Palmer. Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
So Victoria comes from a background in mathematics, completing a master's degree in mathematics with business and finance. And since graduating, she has worked as a data science consultant, working across a range of projects in infrastructure. And she is very passionate about the environment and is keen to explore ideas on how our work within data can be used to benefit our environment with this ultimate goal of saving it. So hopefully we can learn more about that in her talk. So over to you, Victoria.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure I'm sharing sound as well. Cool. So hopefully everyone can see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for the introduction. I guess I'm just going to start with kind of explaining where this came from and what led me to doing this talk today. So I guess a couple of months into the kind of initial COVID lockdown, we started to see some new headlines that appeared in the news, things that we wouldn't normally see around the environment. So basically more positive things, things about lowered emissions, endangered animals starting to breed more, some really nice positive things. And in particular, there was quite a well-known article that came out regarding the emissions around Wuhan in China. I think quite a lot of people have probably seen it. It's basically, having from that lockdown environment and the reduction in, human activity led to a significant decrease in NO2 levels around the Wuhan area. And as the lockdowns kind of spread globally, that pattern was spreading across the world. And that kind of led me to do a bit of a thought piece around, what can we take from what we're learning during COVID about the environment and how our behaviour impacts the environment, and how can we use that information going forwards to change our behaviours and use this as motivation going forwards to help save the environment. So that's kind of a bit of background of where this came to. I kind of started exploring a few more ideas, and I'm going to go in a bit more detail about that today. So quickly before we start, I just want everyone to give themselves a really honest rating out of 10 about how motivated you feel right now to change your everyday behaviours in order to reduce your impact on the environment. I'm not going to ask you to share this. You don't have to share it with anyone. I want this to be as honest as possible, where 0 is you're completely unmotivated and 10 is that you are super motivated and you regularly change day-to-day behaviours. So just make a note of that and just keep it to one side. So I'm going to start with explaining 2 of the top observations from what I'm going to call the COVID year. The first I've kind of already outlined a little bit, which is talking about the new headlines that are appearing in the news. A couple of examples of straight from BBC News here. So record number of endangered turtles hatching in Mexico, and air pollution within the legal limit for the first time. And not only seeing these headlines, it's also knowing exactly what behaviours are leading to these headlines. So knowing that the reduced human activity is what is leading to these things. My second observation was that I was checking for the number of COVID cases daily, and had explored numerous dashboards online, spent hours looking at graphs because I was really interested in what the COVID data was and how the lockdown was impacting those numbers. On top of that, I also noticed that a number of my friends who aren't that interested in data, don't work in the field, normally wouldn't even bat an eyelid at some numbers, were also really interested in this data. And they wanted to know how their behaviour was impacting it. And they wanted to see that decisions were being made based on that data. And I guess that kind of leads me into the third observation, that the government was also making decisions based on this data. And that's particularly relevant at the moment. I think Boris has mentioned a lot about how, coming out of lockdown, he's going to make his decisions on the data rather than the dates. And he's really reiterating that he feels like the data is the source of the truth. So I had the idea of, well, what if we bring these 2 things together? So the idea of we know from the data what behaviours cause to reduce environmental impact, and we now have this interesting data, and hopefully we can have some magic solution that might help us save the environment. So I'm just going to explain the 2 observations in a little bit more detail. I've got a video here which is from NASA, which kind of explains in a little bit more detail about how COVID and lockdowns have impacted emissions. It's quite nice. It shows as we move around the globe and different areas of the world went into lockdown, you can see, compared to their models, how much did we reduce our emissions.
Computer models of Earth's atmosphere can tell us a lot. Trained on how the atmosphere typically operates, the models take in data about temperature, wind speed, humidity, and more to give us important insights into the world around us. Computer models like NASA's GEOS model can help us study how chemicals move through the atmosphere, how the oceans circulate, and where air quality might be affected by fires and pollution. These models can also provide a look at what might have been if circumstances were different. For instance, climate models can forecast how temperatures might change with different levels of carbon emissions. In 2020, the world threw the models a new test when people began behaving very, very differently with almost no warning. A global pandemic set in. Around the globe, people stopped driving and flying in large numbers, started staying home, and completely changed their pollution patterns. In particular, emissions of nitrogen dioxide, a common air pollutant released by cars, airplanes, and many factories, declined significantly. But just how much did the shutdown change our emissions? NASA's GEOS atmospheric composition model offers an answer. The model run functions by assuming that nothing was different in 2020, that people continued behaving roughly the same as they would have with no activity shutdowns, adding the same number of atmospheric pollutants to the air. It's then a matter of subtraction. Comparing those models to real-world observations made by satellites during the shutdowns shows how significant the decrease in pollution was in various cities. Activity shutdowns started in Wuhan, China, and in January, observed emissions of nitrogen dioxide began to diverge from what models predicted, about 60% less than predicted, that is. As the virus and the associated shutdowns moved west, European cities began to experience decreased levels of nitrogen dioxide emissions as well. In Madrid, Spain, nitrogen dioxide emissions were also 60% less than modeled. Shortly after, cities in the United States began to follow suit. In March, New York City shut down all but essential activities, and emissions dropped by 45%. 50 of the 61 analyzed cities show nitrogen dioxide reductions between 20 and 50%, clearly linking lower NO2 emissions to pandemic-related restrictions, and therefore human activity. This sudden change in human behavior gives us new insights into the relationship between human activities and air pollution, which still has many unanswered scientific questions. The only way we can fully understand air pollution is by combining surface observations, satellite data, and computer models. With NASA's satellite monitoring system and computing capabilities, it's uniquely positioned to provide detailed information about air quality everywhere in the world.
So I think that's a really nice summary to just kind of show exactly the impact that the lockdowns had, particularly if we just focus around the Europe area in that video. Pretty much as soon as you see that little green dot on an area to symbolize that an area had gone into lockdown, quite soon afterwards you see a significant decrease in the nitrogen dioxide, quite often down to up to 60% decrease, which is absolutely incredible. Obviously, I'm not saying we should all be in lockdown all the time in order to save the environment, but just having that kind of information can really lead to some really important decisions going forwards. So a little bit more about observation 2. So this is that data has become more of part of our everyday life. I've just kind of taken a few graphs here from BBC News. And these are the kind of things that people are seeing regularly now. And these are the kind of things that people understand and people like to see. And this, what's really nice about this is this data is presented in a really nice way that's easy to interpret. So not only is the data, available to everyone, it's also accessible to everyone. It's great when scientific reports are released with all this data and all the insights from it and all the findings. But this data has been presented in a way that is accessible to everyone, and it pulls in a different group of people that would normally not be interested in this data. So the idea is, how can we pull these two things together? And I'm just going to run through a few examples of what this might look like. So making environmental statistics public knowledge, and that's referring back to not just making them available to everyone, but making them accessible to everyone. Having that information on BBC News for people to see and making it really easy to access so people know where to look and they know how to see it. and drive the urgency of the matter into everyday life. And by making this data accessible and available to everyone, it will help drive this urgency, because people will see the severity of the current situation, rather than, you know, kind of knowing that it's a problem, but not actually seeing the numbers behind it, and therefore not knowing the scale of it. An example of what that might look like is having a BBC News environment section. So I've just taken a screenshot of what my BBC News headline area looks like. And I know this is customizable, and it might be that for some people, they do actually have an environment section there. But for the standard one, we see things like Brexit, coronavirus, and we do have like science and health there. But I think we could also have something like an environment section, which is similar to the COVID section, where we could click on it, we could see all those headlines, we could see the numbers, and we could make it really available. And this will help make the public really aware of the urgency. And I guess the final point, which is probably the most important, is ensuring that the government is using the data to drive their decisions, like they're doing with COVID, and hopefully they can learn from that, and they can see how well that's worked and pull that into other decisions that they're making. So I guess the next question, is it really that simple? Will this work? You know, behavior is a complex thing, and are people actually likely to change their behaviors if they're seeing this data? So I think in order to do that, I'm just going to have a quick look at a behavior model. There's loads of different behavioral models out there. I've chosen this one because it fits really nicely with the situation, and it's easy to explain and understand. Whereas, you know, I'm sure there are some out there that might completely contradict this, or there's some others that are very similar, which are also very interesting. So just to talk through it, we're just going to work through an example that you're receiving a phone call, and what are some of the potential reasons you might not answer. Feel free to pop some reasons in the chat if you want to share some. If not, don't worry, but just have a think. What are some reasons why you might not answer the phone if it was ringing right now, for example? I'll just give you a minute to have a think and pop some answers in the chat if you want to. Great, so we've got a couple coming through. Great, so I'm just going to talk through some of the answers I've come up with, and then also pull in some that are coming through on the chat now. Feel free to keep adding some as they come to you. So some reasons you might not answer the phone: you're in a meeting, you're in the shower, you didn't hear it, you were busy, and one came through, you know, you have a headache, or it's not the right time to take the call. Someone's just put there in the middle of a Netflix binge. So all of those things kind of fall into the category of an ability factor. Do you currently have the ability to answer the phone? If you didn't hear it, maybe you don't have the ability. You know, if you're in a meeting, you can't answer the phone right now. If you're busy, you also can't answer the phone. Now, some of the other factors that might come in, I've seen a few examples like this, things like unknown number, or you just didn't want to. So you might have seen who was calling and you didn't want to answer. You might be in a bad mood, or you might just not want to talk to someone at that point. And those things kind of fall under the motivational factor. So you have the ability to answer the phone, you can see that your phone's ringing, but do you actually want to answer the phone? So that's whether or not you have the motivation to do the action. So putting these three things together is stating that for a behavior to happen, you need a trigger, which is the phone ringing, an ability, and the motivation. And when you pull those three things together, you will successfully complete the behavior. So what does that mean around COVID and the environment? So when we pull those together, we get the FOG behaviour model. And this is basically saying that in order to do something that is really difficult, we need a lot of motivation to do it. And in order to do something that's nice and easy, we might not need a lot of motivation. And there's a line that goes between the two. And if we're above the line, then the behaviour will succeed. And if we're below, it won't. Now, for me, I'd currently say that COVID is sitting quite high in the hard to do section and requires quite a lot of motivation. I feel that what we're being asked to do at the moment is very difficult. You know, we're not being able to see our families, our friends. We're being asked to stay inside all the time. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So in order for us to do that, we require a lot of motivation. And that motivation is coming through, you know, the daily coronavirus briefings, the data that we're constantly being shown, and not just the negative data, but also the positive data. So being able to see that the cases are dropping from this lockdown, to be able to see that the number of deaths are going down from this lockdown, all that is providing us motivation to think, I can do this for a little bit longer because it's working. And, you know, in the end, I will be free because of this. So what I think would be really nice to do when we kind of go back to some more normality is put the environment in where COVID currently sits. And don't get me wrong, there are loads of things we can do for the environment that are really easy to do and therefore don't require a lot of motivation. And those are probably a lot of things that we're currently already doing in our everyday life. Things like having keep cups, you know, not using plastic water bottles and so on. But there's also a lot of things that are a lot harder to do, which require a lot more motivation in order to make that change. Maybe thinking, you know, oh, it's easy for me to just drive to the cinema. It's a little bit harder for me to cycle, walk, or get the train. So you need a little bit more motivation to make those kind of behavioural changes. So in order to do those hard to do, you know, behaviour changes, we need a lot of motivation for that as well. So we also need to see the same sort of data around the environment that we're seeing for COVID. So what might that look like? What might this data look like that we need to see? I'm just going to run through a couple of different examples of some things that I found which I think could help. So the first one is looking at the number of deaths by air pollution. So this graph here is just summarising the number of deaths by risk factor in the United Kingdom in 2017. At the top, probably not so surprising, we've got things like smoking, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, obesity. But the fifth highest one is outdoor air pollution, and below that is air pollution that's outdoor and indoor. When I first saw this, I thought that was shocking. Like I already knew that this was a problem, but I didn't realise it was quite so bad. And it's not just thinking, you know, these are deaths. When we think about it with coronavirus, you know, part of the reason we're so concerned is we're worried about our friends and our family. It's exactly the same for air pollution. If we know people who live in a city that is very polluted, they're at risk to these diseases that are causing these deaths as well. Another example is talking about the pollution costs to the NHS. It's been absolutely fantastic in the past year how much, you know, the general population has come to appreciate the NHS. And I think we can do more. I mean, it's amazing how much we can appreciate them and the clap for the NHS, but I think there are also things we can do in our behaviours to also benefit the NHS. So pollution is massively costly to the NHS, and the total NHS and social care costs due to PM 2.5 and NO2, which are two of the biggest pollutants, is 42.88 million. And that's just cases that we have really robust evidence where we can link the disease to pollution. If we lessen the robustness required, that goes up to 157 million, which is an extortionate amount of money. And that's money that could be reinvested in the NHS in other ways and provided with other benefits. You know, the catchphrases around coronavirus and the NHS, you know, save lives, protect the NHS. We can also protect the NHS through other methods as well going forward. So like things around the environment, if we can lessen the pressure from disease caused by pollution, we're taking some of the pressure off the NHS. And the third one I'm going to talk through is attributable hospital cases per 100,000 per area. So this one probably is kind of familiar around COVID. I know on BBC News there's a big map which has the number of COVID cases per 100,000 per different areas across the UK. So this would be a similar thing, but instead we're talking about attributable hospital cases caused by pollution. Now the example here I've got is a prediction, and it's if the current air pollution levels persist and looking at 2035. But if the current air pollution levels do persist, they've predicted that there could be a number of disease cases due to NO2 exposure in somewhere like Lambeth could be 3,331 of new cases of disease per 100,000. And putting that into proportion of something, when we were in our worst COVID situation, we were looking at 1,000 cases per 100,000 in some areas. So that's 3 times the amount of that. And of course, this is a future prediction, and hopefully we can make changes that will reduce this. But you know, having numbers like this really shows the severity of the situation, and also having numbers that we can really relate to specific areas. So if you live in an area and you know that that area is bad, you're going to feel a lot more, well, I know I would feel a lot more motivated to want to make that change. I used to live in Southampton, which is an incredibly polluted area. And, you know, because you're aware of that, you want to make changes in your behaviour, thinking, you know, I know there's a lot of pollution here. What can I do to fix it? And what can we do as a community to try and reduce the pollution levels? Because, you know, if it's in your area, you know it's going to impact you and it's going to impact your friends and family. So thinking back to the beginning of this talk, where I asked you to rate yourself out of 10, how you felt, how motivated you felt to change your everyday behaviours. just want you to look back on that, and after hearing this data and hearing some more information about it, think now, how motivated do you feel now that you know some of these numbers and you have a bit more of an idea of the severity? Maybe you already knew all this, and maybe that means you haven't changed your motivation level. But hopefully for some people, you now feel maybe a little bit more motivated, and hopefully that's kind of semi-proved the idea that, you know, having the information behind the situation can help drive people to be motivated to make that behavioural change. I'm just going to finish off on, you know, a more optimistic note, because I'm aware that this is quite doom and gloom. But a nice quote from David Attenborough, that human beings are the greatest problem solvers our planet has ever known, and we are just yet to apply ourselves to this problem with the scale and the urgency it requires, which I 100% agree with. I mean, that urgency is just that motivation. We just haven't provided that motivation and that urgency that we need to solve this problem. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I've got time for some questions. So if you just want to pop those in the chat, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really great. It was really insightful. I'm definitely more motivated to try making a change environmentally. Just checking to see if there are any questions. There are a few things coming up in the chat, so you can probably respond to that there. But just in the interest of time, I am going to hand over to Zaremba to introduce the next speaker. Thank you, Victoria.
Great, thank you very much.